Behind the Wall, I'm Stan Grant. As China continues to grow its military capabilities and tensions continue to rise with Taiwan, so too has discussion about a possible conflict with the biggest power in the Asia-Pacific. In fact, last week, the Home Affairs Secretary Mike Pezzullo said free nations are again hearing the beating drums of war. But is this actually a possibility? What could such a conflict achieve? And is all this talk actually counterproductive? John Blaxland is a professor at the Strategic and Defence Studies Centre at the Australian National University, and he joins me from Canberra. John, good to see you. I want to go first of all to all of this war talk at the moment. Now, some people have been very careful not to specifically name China, but there's no doubt who they're talking about. There's no doubt what this moment represents with the rise of China's power. Are we, in fact, on a trajectory to war?
Look, I think a lot of it depends on how we play our cards, to be honest. China is an expansionary power, and it's understandable. Its growth economically has been absolutely extraordinary, and it has challenged its neighbours. It's challenged the United States, which has spent the last 2 decades sadly spending over $2 trillion in the sands of the Middle East to little effect. And, you know, we actively supported US policy in Iraq and Afghanistan, thinking we were being clever by investing in the relationship with the United States, not realising that we were actually contributing to a partial bankrupting of our principal ally. And what we've seen in the meantime is that China's grown. We have been the beneficiaries of that growth. Australia's economic prosperity is to a large extent a result of the trade we've undertaken with China and with everyone else who's benefited from the market economics globally. But is war likely? I would put to you that China wants to get what it wants without having to go to war. And so the question is, we use the word war in all sorts of different ways, Stan. You know, we talk about a war on drugs. We talk, you know, we use it flippantly, and I think we actually need to be very careful when we use it in the context of international relations. And
just on that point, John, if I could come in, is it possible then that you can talk yourself into just this sort of conflict? Because there are so many moving parts. There are so many fault lines. Korea, East China Sea, South China Sea, Taiwan. Yes, China is being a lot more assertive, even aggressive in its language and in its expansion. Can you, in fact, talk yourself into a position from which neither side can back down?
Well, that's the problem. And, you know, Australia hasn't really bought in on shaping the strategy very much in our neighbourhood that much. We've kind of left it to the United States to do by and large. And what we're finding is that Australia really does have to buy in. It's more important for us now than ever because the unipolar moment has passed. We're now in a circumstance where what happens with the United States, what their actions, what the effect of their actions are quite consequential for Australia. Same with the actions of China. And of course, it's the interaction of those two that is particularly putting us at risk because for the first time in generations, that potentially involves clashing between the great powers in a way that might suck us into a vortex.
And just on that, John, in terms of sucking us into a vortex, Australia is in fact out in front of many other countries, indeed perhaps even the United States, when it comes to the rhetoric, some of the language that we're hearing, the drawing of lines in the sand. Australia is actually talking up the prospects of this conflict, perhaps even more than others. So why? What is the strategy here?
Yeah, so I don't know if there's a clear strategy, Stan, but I think there are a couple of things worth bearing in mind. One is that we've got a defence force that's essentially structured for the unipolar moment, for the end of the Cold War, when essentially the United States was really comfortable doing the heavy lifting and which we only had to make niche contributions alongside them. Those days have gone, but we are left with a defence force that is essentially not structured for the real world of today. And what we've seen is while China's economic growth has been extraordinary, its military growth has also been extraordinary. And I think what we're seeing is, and to give Mike Pezzullo credit, I think what he was getting at was, hey, folks in Australia, the world is not what it used to be. We have a boutique defence force structured for the unipolar moment. Those days are gone. Actually, we need to really reposture.
And we've already recognised that because Australia is involved in that now. $250 billion extra over the next 10 years. Last year, the Prime Minister said we are living in a poorer, more disordered and more dangerous world. There is the prospect of conflict in the Indo-Pacific. The Quad group between India, Japan, the United States and Australia is coming together, and perhaps even militarily as a hedge against China's power. But I want to ask you this, because you make a very interesting observation that Taiwan obviously is one of the key flashpoints. If push came to shove, if there was a conflict there, that perhaps the United States and Taiwan would not prevail.
No, exactly right. It's not at all clear that they would prevail, and the trajectory of the Chinese People's Liberation Army capabilities, Army, Navy, Air, Space, Missile, Cyber Force, has been growing exponentially. And this is where the commander of the Indo-Pacific Command in Hawaii made the point that he reckons we've got 6 years. I think that's the point at which China will probably feel they're comfortable, that they can now assert themselves in a way that they threaten war and can actually go there confident that they can win. So I don't think they're at the point where they're confident they can win at this stage, and I don't think they want to go there. But I think the point is, you know, this is classic Sun Tzu strategy. The acme of skill is to defeat your adversary without fighting, and to do that, you've got to make them think you will win. And so building up this capability, it's about prestige, it's about positioning, and it's also about intimidating Taiwan and the United States, and of course, you know, small to middle powers like Australia, to back off, basically.
And Xi Jinping says, John, he says this openly, that he believes that the East, China, is rising and that the West is in decline, and that he can push things to the limit and not get a response from the United States, not get a response from the West. Final question to you. Is Xi Jinping at risk of overplaying his hand here? A military adventure that goes wrong would be disastrous for him. He is fighting on many fronts. There are fault lines right across the region. China shares many borders. And just last year, they were involved in a skirmish with Indian troops on their contested border. China, too, isn't it, very vulnerable right now?
Indeed. I think there's a growing recognition that China's acerbic action, there's some scope for some deterrent, some pushback. And some would argue that China will keep pushing forward until it meets resistance. And I think there's some merit to that argument. And so when we think about what the points of resistance are, China is, as you say, quite vulnerable. It's got 14 neighbours. It actually relies incredibly heavily on trade through the jugular vein of the Indo-Pacific. That's the Malacca Strait, presenting that what they call the Malacca Dilemma, which does mean that China has to be pretty circumspect about how it exercises that power, mindful that crossing the kinetic threshold is not something it wants to do, but were it to goad somebody else into overplaying its hand, an American hammer looking for a nail, dare I say, that might be a convenient excuse. So this is about gamesmanship. It's about playing cleverly to maximise their desired end state, which is, let's face it, and Xi's declared this publicly, he wants to take over Taiwan, and he'll do it by force if needs be. That's what he's saying, and I think the sense is that he's hoping that that will intimidate everybody to back off and let him take it. Whether that's the case or not, here's another important aspect too, I think, to what we're talking about, Stan. There is a domestic political dimension to what's going on here. And I think we should be mindful that while I agree we need to be sober-minded about the scale of the challenge we're facing into the future, and actually not be complacent about our boutique defence force or our ability to assert ourselves, because I think that is important. We should be doing it very, very discretion and with a long term in mind, mindful of just how vulnerable Australia is and how much we need friends and partners in the neighbourhood in Southeast Asia and beyond to work collaboratively with us, and at the same time not unduly poke the dragon.
John Blaxland, always a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you again, sir.
Thank you, Stan.